Hello, everybody. This is Dr. G. I am back at the Burton Public Library in beautiful Burton, Ohio. I have not read in probably over a week to you. This is Melissa. It is by Alex Gino, and it is a banned book, and it's probably been banned because there is some discussion about a person who is dealing with his or her his and her gender. And I am on chapter 2 where it says Charlotte dies. Miss Udall leaned against her giant desk, reading to her fourth grade class from a tattered copy of Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. She wore her shiny black hair in a loose bun and wooden earrings dangling from her long earlobes. Hi, everybody. Dr. G forgot to say hi for me. Okay, you're right, I did. In her seat by the window, George couldn't listen. She couldn't think. Charlotte, the wonderful, kind spider, was gone and nothing was good. The whole book was about Charlotte saving the runt pig Wilbur, and then she goes and dies. It wasn't fair. George pushed her fists into her eyes, rubbing until rows and rows of tiny triangles twirled and twinkled brightly in the darkness. A tear dropped into George's book and spread into a spider web on the page. She breathed in carefully, trying not to make a sound. Shallow breath followed shallow breath until she was dizzy. Excuse me. She inhaled deeply, and as she did, she sniffled loudly. George heard whispers clear in the quiet room. Hey, some girl is crying over a dead spider. That ain't no girl. That's George. Close enough, followed by laughter. George didn't turn to look. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what she would see. Rick sat 2 rows over from George, and Jeff sat behind Rick. Jeff would be leaning forward in his seat with his spiky hair nearly on Rick's shoulder. Rick would be leaning back in his shiny black baseball jacket. They would both be holding their hands to their mouths, half heartedly trying to keep quiet. These boys do not seem very nice. Once, George and Rick had been friends, or at least friendly. In second grade, there had been a class checkers tournament, and George and Rick had been the two best players. The final match of the competition had been close, with Rick barely winning after he'd been able to king his final piece. Even though George had lost, the two had still called each other checker champs for weeks. In third grade, Jeff joined the class. Jeff had moved from California and wasn't happy about it. He started a few fist fights and threatened most of the boys at first, including George. But Jeff settled in by October, and once Jeff and Rick became buddies, Rick wasn't so friendly with George anymore. Have you ever had that situation happen? People switching up friendships, you just sometimes don't know where you fit in. It's a tough time. By winter break, Jeff and Rick were inseparable, and now it was as if checkers champs were two kids who had known each other once, had never met either George or Rick. Mrs. Udall glared at the snickering boys, cleared her throat, and read the final paragraph of the chapter. Her students were old enough that she rarely read aloud to them, but today she wanted them to be able to focus on what she called the magnificent melancholy of Charlotte's final moments. Have you read Charlotte's Web before? Fantastic book, and I'm glad this author is writing about it. Maybe I'll read that book one day. I'd love that. I'd love that. When she was finished, Mrs. Udall closed the book, placed it on top of a pile of papers on her desk, and removed her glasses. I'd like you all to take out your journals and spend a few minutes with your reactions to this chapter. You may take a moment to reflect, but then get your pencils moving. I want you to dig deep and use some feeling words. How many of you have been given these writing exercises by your teachers before? They read something or you read something, and then they want you to write a reflection. Have you ever found that kind of challenging? Maybe you don't feel like writing feeling words. That's pretty hard. Maybe one day I'll give you some suggestions. Anyway, back to the book. Room 205, filled with sounds of journals being removed from desks, pages being turned, and pencils being searched for. Mrs. Udell walked down the aisle toward Jeff and Rick and spoke to them privately. Her voice blended in with the noise of the room, so George could barely hear her, even though she was only 2 seats away. Some of us take death very seriously. Mrs. Udell's words were icy. She looked at Jeff and Rick in turn. They each stared at their sneakers. It is a solemn topic, and I hope that you will respect yourselves, your classmates, and life itself by treating it as such. Boy, she let those boys know. Jeff and Rick mumbled apologies. George wasn't sure whether their half-hearted sorries were meant for her, Mrs. Udell, or Charlotte. She wasn't sure she cared. The moment Mrs. Udell turned away, Jeff rolled his eyes. Jeff was always rolling his eyes at something, usually with a snide comment to match. Mrs. Udell passed by George's desk. To be honest, I'm not sure what I think of a person who doesn't cry at the end of Charlotte's Web. Sounds like Mrs. Udell is going ahead and making George feel a little better about crying. You didn't? George mumbled. I did the first 3 times and a good number of times since. Mrs. Udell paused, and for a moment it looked as if she might tear up right then. My point is, it takes a special person to cry over a book. It shows compassion as well as imagination. Mrs. Udell patted George's shoulder. Don't ever lose that, George, and I know you'll turn into a fine young man. The word man hit like a pile of rocks falling on George's skull. It was 100 times worse than boy, and she couldn't breathe. She bit her lip fiercely and felt tears pounding against her eyes. She put her head down on her desk and wished she were invisible. Mrs. Udell returned with the bathroom pass. It was a worn wooden block from a kindergarten class and read boys in thick green permanent marker on one side. George flipped the block over with a hollow slap, so the side facing her read room 205. Mrs. Udell put her hand on George's shoulder, but George took her off and stood up. She could barely see her way to the classroom door through her tear-blurred eyes, and she navigated the hallway more from memory than sight. She stumbled, sobbing, into the bathroom, the boys' bathroom. Her lips trembled with salty tears dripping into her mouth. George hated the boys' bathroom. It was the worst room in the school. She hated the smell of pee and bleach, and she hated the blue tiles on the wall to remind you where you were, as if the urinals didn't make it obvious enough. The whole room was about being a boy, and when boys were in there, they liked to talk about what was between their legs. George tried never to use it when there were any boys inside. She never drank from the water fountains at school, even if she was thirsty, and some days she could make it through the whole day without having to go once. George put her head down close to the faucet and splashed cold water over her neck until she shivered. Then she rubbed a clump of paper towels on her head. She combed strings of still wet hair with her fingers and smiled weakly at herself in the mirror. Back in the hallway, George held the hall pass loosely in her fingers and let it drag along the wall, sending vibrations up her hand. The rhythmic click echoed down the hall as the wooden block skipped over the thin strips of cement between the tiles. George opened the classroom door slowly, fearing laughter, but students were too focused on their journals to notice her return. The topic, personal reactions, was written on the board in Mrs. Udell's careful print. George pulled out her journal and wrote the date and the topic. By the time she had written, Charlotte is dead, journal time was over. Mrs. Udell didn't ask anyone to read aloud. Instead, she addressed the class. Tomorrow the real fun begins. For now, I am pleased to say that we are done for the day. She spoke the rhyme as if it were a short poem. Put away your notebooks and we'll see which row is ready to get its things. By fun, Mrs. Udell was referring to the play version of Charlotte's Web that the two fourth grade classes would perform for the younger grades. It was a school tradition that each spring every student in the first through fourth grades read the same book. The first graders had the story read to them by their teachers, and sometimes even the kindergartners participated. Every grade then did some sort of project. As the oldest students participating, the fourth graders put on a play of the book for the younger grades as well as for the Parent Teacher Association. Only the fifth grade wasn't involved. Because they needed to focus on spring tests to make sure they graduated and moved on to middle school. Mrs. Udell had called 4 rows of students, and the room was filled with the sounds of zippers and backpacks being dropped onto wooden desks. George's row was the last to be called, and the kids in it had their eyes trained on Mrs. Udell. Row 1. Chairs screeched against the floor. George gathered her things slowly, stalling as long as she could before joining the boys' line. She wanted as much distance from Jeff and Rick as possible. Mrs. Udell's class walked through the halls of the school and down to the yard. The bus kids were released as a group, while other children waited with Mrs. Udell to meet up with their parents, grandparents, or babysitters. George headed to her bus line. George, wait up, a voice called from behind her. Kelly, George's best friend, wore her hair in braids and smelled like oranges and pencil shavings. She wore a t-shirt that read 99% genius, 1% chocolate. My dad said you could come over this weekend to practice, she said as soon as she got to George. She had been chattering about the auditions all week. You do still want to be in the play together, right? Ooh, are you starting to see there's going to be a play? I wonder what role George wants. George did want to be in the play more than anything, but she didn't want to be some smelly pig. She wanted to be Charlotte, the kind and wise spider, even if it was a girl's part. Her mouth was open, but she couldn't speak. Kelly held up her hands, palms in front of George's eyes. I am Kelly, the all wonderful and all knowing, she intoned. I can sense that you are not well. Now, my child, what seems to be your problem? She closed her eyes and slowly brought her hands to the sides of George's head, peeking just a little bit to make sure she didn't poke her best friend's eyes out. If you're all knowing, then don't you already know? George asked. Kelly opened her eyes long enough to cross them so that they pointed at her nose. Then she fluttered her eyelids shut. Fine. I am Kelly, the all wonderful and mostly knowing. I will try to sense your problem. She opened her eyes again and dropped her hands. I know. You've got stage fright. I thought all about stage fright. My Uncle Bill says my dad has terrible stage fright, and that's why he lets other people get rich performing his songs. It's not stage fright. Okay, maybe not. I don't know. My dad has stage fright. My dad, excuse me, I don't think my dad has stage fright either. He's just a different kind of artist. Kelly shook George's shoulder. But then what is it? You know, I can't handle suspense. Tell me or you'll what? Kelly's eyes gleamed with inspiration. Or I'll bring out my army of beasts to attack you in the night and suck out your brains with a crazy straw and make you one of my minions so you have to do everything I say, including telling me what you're thinking about. What is it? What is it? What is it? George looked around to make sure no one else could hear. Okay, calm down. Here's the thing. I don't really want to be Wilbur in the play, she told Kelly. Oh, that's not a problem. There are a lot of other parts in the play. They're called supporting roles. My dad says the best performers would be nothing without an excellent supporting cast. Let Mrs. Udell hear you and decide what part you should have. I don't want just any part, said George. Well, who do you want to be? Templeton the rat? George shook her head. Avery? Kelly guessed. Mr. Zuckerman. Mr. Arabelle. George shook her head. Who else is there? Kelly asked incredulously. I want to be Charlotte, George whispered. Kelly shrugged. That's cool. If you want to be Charlotte, you should try out for Charlotte. You make such a big deal out of everything. Who cares if you're not really a girl? George's stomach dropped. She cared. Tons. On the street, one of the buses started its engines. I gotta go, Kelly broke into a run. 1, 2, 3, she called behind her. Zoot, George replied. Back in first grade, Kelly and George had decided that saying 1, 2, 3, zoot was a lot more fun than saying goodbye. They had heard it on a cartoon, and it made them laugh all day. Neither of them could remember anymore what show it was from, and sometimes it seemed silly to still be saying 1, 2, 3, zoot, but neither wanted to be the first one to stop. That night, George dreamed she was on stage as Charlotte. She wore all black with extra limbs running down her sides, and she recited the most beautiful words for the entire auditorium to hear. Her first line was delivered perfectly, as was the second. But then there was a strange noise overhead. George looked up, but all she could see was a heavy stage curtain, which enveloped her in a stuffy darkness before knocking her off the ladder. Then she was falling and couldn't breathe for what felt like a long time. George woke up in a sweat. It took a moment to realize she was awake in her bed and not suffocating. Her bed sheet was twisted around her legs. Still, she couldn't shake the image of being Charlotte. As she ate her cereal and milk, as she dressed in jeans and a t shirt, as she brushed her teeth, she pictured herself greeting the audience with a fine salutations. She should be the one to declare Wilbur terrific, and she should be the one to make people cry with her final farewell. And that is the end of chapter 2. Fascinating. Love this story. Kudos to the author.